And we are back. Our guest today is an acclaimed historian whose latest book, called Freeman's Challenge, analyzes a dark chapter of American history, shedding light on the enduring impact of profit-driven prisons and the fight against racial injustice. Here now is the Dillon Professor of American History at Harvard University, Robert Bernstein, and thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
You know, it comes at a time where we as America are just going through it right now. But in order to know where you're going, I always talk about you got to talk about where you come from. And when we talk about this issue of prison, we're presently dealing with mass incarceration, presently dealing with the prison to pipeline system. And as I like to tell people, these things didn't happen overnight. It happened over time.
That's right. That's exactly right. In order to understand where we are, we have to understand where we've been, how we got here, and who brought us here. It didn't happen by magic. It was not inevitable in any way. So what my book does is it brings us into the actual invention of profit-driven incarceration. This is a history that's just under 200 years old. But it's not 1,000 years old, it's not 10,000 years old. This is relatively recent. It was invented by individuals who you will meet in Freeman's Challenge. So what I'm trying to do in this book is show us how this dastardly, diabolical idea started, this idea that one person can and should profit off another person's incarceration, that one person's incarceration should benefit a private corporation or a state. Why should that happen? That's a very strange idea. And by showing the individuals who actually came up with that idea and the impact of that idea on William Freeman, who was a teenager who resisted and fought back against prison for profit at its source, what I'm hoping it will do is make us look at the present moment in a new way and say, yes, these ideas that are very second nature to us, that a prison, it can, you know, on the one hand, prison is bad, but on the other hand, it creates jobs. That's actually a bizarre idea.
Right.
Why should anybody benefit from a prison? Let's actually hear the bizarreness of that idea.
Well, you know, the other part about the bizarreness is that I tell people is that they don't always understand that when it comes to prisons and you have populations, smaller cities who have prison populations are now able to use those prisoners as a part of the population when it comes to trying to obtain funding or making their case for certain things.
That's right.
But the reality is you're not from here. You're just being housed here. But another way that the prison system is actually benefiting corporations, governments, and far from the people.
That's right. That's absolutely right.
Yeah. Talk to me a little bit about your book, because as you talk about this here, there is social motivation through incarceration. From what you can tell us, what were the social motivations for this prison industrial system?
Well, it was begun in 1816, and it was begun in a very specific place. It was begun in Auburn, New York, which was at the time a tiny little village in the Finger Lakes area, not far from Syracuse, where I know you live.
Right.
And it was invented by a group of white entrepreneurs. And they basically had this idea that if they could win a state contract to build a prison, that state contract, the money, would be able to would enable them to transform their village into a city, and it would benefit them personally as businessmen and also as people who had an interest in real estate. It would increase the real estate of Auburn. So at the time, the state was offering $20,000 to build a new prison. Now, $20,000 is the equivalent in 1816 is the equivalent of about $500,000 today. And Auburn at the time was a tiny little village of about 2,000 people. So you can imagine if you take a village of 2,000 people and you flood it with $500,000 all of a sudden with more money to come in perpetuity, that is going to completely transform the area. It's going to transform the town. Now, to us, that's obvious. But the only reason it's obvious is because these white entrepreneurs invented this strategy for sucking money out of the state, putting it into a prison, and then using that money to build industries in the prison and around the prison. And then they had a second diabolical idea, which was to actually build the prison around factories. They built factories into the prison. They built the prison by the banks of a river for the purpose of capturing water power to power these factories. So the idea from the beginning was that not only would they be sucking money out of the state, they would also be sucking labor out of incarcerated people for the purpose of benefiting private corporations. So this was a revolutionary idea. And one thing that I want to say that's really important was that the founders of the Auburn State Prison had no interest whatsoever in reforming people. The purpose was not rehabilitation. That was completely off the table. They did not care.
That's a term we heard later on.
Yeah,
but
that's
there was
exactly
no,
right.
There was no original purpose.
Nothing. And they also, believe it or not, did not care about punishment. They were not interested in punishing prisoners because punishment, and this is very counterintuitive, punishment was actually understood as a benefit because punishment could provoke penitence. Punishment could help make a prisoner a better person, in theory. But this was a system that was much more akin to slavery. And let's remember that in 1816, New York State was still a slave state. New York State still enslaved people. And so this profit-driven prison, the Auburn State Prison, was being built on the model of slavery. Part of the concept of slavery is that the enslaved person has no right to benefit from their own labor. And so this was the model for labor in the Auburn State Prison. This is what became known as the Auburn System. And the Auburn System, created in New York State, invented by a bunch of white entrepreneurs, then spread throughout the Northeast, it spread throughout the United States, it spread throughout the world. And today, some of the most notorious prisons in the United States to this day were built absolutely consciously, explicitly modeled on the Auburn System. So we can think about San Quentin, for example, Angola, Parchman, Sing Sing. These were all built on the Auburn System.
Let me talk to you about William Freeman, because that's main character in your book here.
Yeah.
And so when we talk about William Freeman, introduce us to him.
Yeah.
Why is he so important, and what's the significance with him to the prison system?
So William Freeman happened to be born in Auburn, New York. So he grew up next to the Auburn State Prison. And he was an African-American and also Native American teenager. So he grew up, he was also part of the most prominent black family in town. His grandparents, Harry and Kate, who were the people who chose the name Freeman, which tells you everything you need to know about what they valued, how they thought of themselves, who they considered themselves to be, who they wanted to be. Harry and Kate Freeman had partially built Auburn. And while they were building white Auburn, they also built black Auburn. They built a community that was known as New Guinea. And William Freeman grew up in this prominent black family, a beloved black family, in this vibrant community of New Guinea that was full of social life and religion and politics. It was a good place to grow up. But his life changed forever in 1840. He was 15 years old, and he was accused of stealing a horse. There was no evidence against him, but that didn't matter. He was tried, he was convicted, and he was sentenced to 5 years hard labor in the Auburn State Prison. Now, William Freeman had been free-born. He had been born in 1824. He was always free. His grandparents had been enslaved. His father had been enslaved. They had all become free. They had all named themselves Freeman. And here he was, imprisoned for a crime that he swore he did not commit, forced to labor for no wages at all, to benefit only other people, not to benefit himself in any way. And William Freeman resisted. He resisted from the moment he got into the Auburn State Prison. He resisted first with words, And then later he resisted legally. He tried to use the law to recover what he saw as his right to wages. And then finally he resorted to violence. And that is what the book is about. The book is about how Freeman challenged the Auburn State prison, how he challenged prison for profit at its root, and what happened next.
We know. Let's talk about it for a minute. Harriet Tubman.
Harriet Tubman.
Frederick Douglass.
Frederick Douglass.
Very instrumental in what we're talking about right here.
Yeah, yeah.
How?
Yeah, so in different ways. So when William Freeman made this challenge to the Auburn State Prison, at first he was laughed at, and at first he was dismissed. And that was when he was using words, that's when he was trying to use the law. He also, when he resisted within the Auburn State Prison, he became the victim of terrible violence. Guards beat him horribly, they whipped him, and they also waterboarded him. The Auburn State Prison actually invented a new form of waterboarding, and I have a lot of images in the book, and a couple of the images show this horrible waterboarding machine that they invented. I have two images, one that shows how they thought about the waterboarding machine, the ones who invented it, as this nice thing, and how it really affected people. So Freeman, in his challenge, he became a victim of terrible violence, but at this point he hadn't scared anybody. But then when he committed violence, when he committed the murder that is in the title of the book is Freeman's Challenge, the murder that shook America's original prison for profit. So you know from the very beginning of the book that he is going to commit a murder. Once he committed that murder, then white people got really frightened. And white people could no longer dismiss him. They could no longer laugh him off. They had to deal with him in one way or another. And that's when a lot of very prominent people got involved. And one of the people who had to deal with the fallout was Frederick Douglass, because Frederick Douglass was arguably the most prominent abolitionist in New York State at the time. And he had to manage the terror that was being unleashed by William Freeman, along with a lot of other abolitionists, people like William Wells Brown. And what they decided to do collectively was not defend him. They did not defend William Freeman. They did not excuse him. Instead, what they did was Freeman's story got twisted. His story got horribly twisted. There was a very big, very spectacular trial that made national headlines. Celebrities got involved in the trial, white celebrities. And then people like Frederick Douglass had to deal with the fallout. And the way they decided to do it was by telling their own stories. And telling their own stories in Auburn. So Auburn, before William Freeman's trial, was not an important site for black abolitionists. It was somewhat important for white abolitionists, but black abolitionists were kind of skipping over it. There was a lecture circuit. Auburn was not important on the lecture circuit. The moment Freeman goes to trial, Auburn becomes crucial to abolitionist lecture circuits. And people like Frederick Douglass come back multiple times. He never came to Auburn before, but immediately after, he starts coming and returning multiple times to Auburn to tell his own story from his own perspective. And this is a counterweight to the terrible racist stories that white people were telling about William Freeman. And in comes Frederick Douglass telling his own story. One of his autobiographies, My Bondage and My Freedom, was originally published in Auburn. So Auburn became a center for abolitionism. And you asked about Harriet Tubman, shall I?
Yes. Well, before I come back to
Yeah.
Harriet, I'll come back to Harriet Tubman in a minute. I want to go forward now.
Sure,
Right?
sure.
Because we know some history. We've got and you've done a great job in detailing. I want to talk about what are the similarities from Freeman's challenge to today.
Yeah.
Are there a lot?
Yeah.
From your perspective?
Yeah, so many. What a lot of people have told me is that the book is very uncannily familiar. That a lot of what I am describing is completely relevant now. And actually, one person I know who is formerly incarcerated told me that the experience I described of Freeman's incarceration touched him, that it resonated with his own experience. And on the one hand, I was very glad that I got it right. On the other hand, I was so sorry that I got it right.
Right.
That this is still the experience, this crushing experience of being incarcerated that William Freeman had is very similar to the experience of being incarcerated today. So some of the similarities, especially specifically in New York State, are that Freeman had no choice about whether to work. Today, incarcerated people, if they are told to work in New York State, they have no choice. They have to work. And this is something that's actually being addressed right now by a very important act called the No Slavery in New York Act, which is being considered by the New York State legislation right now. And the purpose of the No Slavery in New York Act is to make illegal exactly what Freeman was challenging. Freeman was challenging the fact that he was forced to work. The No Slavery in New York Act challenges the fact that incarcerated New Yorkers are still forced to work. So there's a chance that the story in Freeman's challenge could end, and it could end this year if the legislature passes the bill. The Senate already passed it, and now it's going to the Assembly.
Yeah. And for yourself, the thought that we're still in 2024 talking about what transpired in the 1800s, what kind of feeling does that give you?
Well, it keeps me in business as a historian.
Right.
But no, it's very upsetting. It's deeply upsetting that this story that took place 170 years ago is completely contemporary. And people who have never been incarcerated have told me how uncanny it is, how familiar it feels. People who've been incarcerated say the same, and it's enormously sad. Enough. Let's end slavery in New York State. Let's end slavery everywhere. It is time to end the profit motive in incarceration. It is time to say incarceration should have nothing to do with profiteering.
Right. And when we look at American labor, and when we look at profiteering through American labor, incarceration has served as a huge means to an end there.
Absolutely.
For yourself, the conversations that you're having after writing the book, what are you hearing from people? Are you hearing a sense that, well, it is what it is? Or are you hearing more of, no, there's something that we need to do about this?
Yeah. Well, of course, there's a very large movement to end prison, or at least to end prison as we know it, to end profit-driven prison. And so a lot of people have told me that the book has made them think about incarceration in a new way. I want to denaturalize some ideas. I want us to hear the weirdness of some of the ideas that we've inherited, and to understand, to make the familiar strange. One really good way to make the familiar strange is to look at the origins and to know that these ideas were invented by highly flawed individuals, and in some case, outright evil individuals who came up with these ideas that now we kind of take for granted. So, like I mentioned before, the idea that a reasonable justification for building a prison is that it will create jobs. That is actually a completely unreasonable justification. And I want this book to enable people to hear that weirdness. And I also want people to hear Freeman's challenge. Freeman was silenced during his lifetime. People worked very hard to silence William Freeman. And it is time to hear his challenge, and it is time to finally enact what he wanted, and especially right here in New York State.
You talk about Freeman being silenced. There's so many people who are silenced right now just by having to engage in forced labor. So many people are silenced right now because they don't have the opportunity, and they've, been the other side of that prison, that mass incarceration pipeline. As you look right now and you look around and you see what's happening, talk to me about future projections, because as we talk about, your book, right, it really talks about history, but then it also speaks to the present and potentially the future. What kind of future projections could we have if we take Freeman's challenge seriously?
Well, we could end forced labor in New York. There's also a twin act or a paired act called the Fairness and Opportunity Act, which is also coming up before the New York State Legislature. And this is another act that directly speaks to Freeman's challenge. Freeman wanted to be paid for his work, and he also wanted the right to choose not to work. But the reason he wanted to be paid for his work, he didn't just want the money for its own sake, although there's nothing wrong with wanting wages for the work you do. But what he really wanted was a fair wage that would enable him to build a life, a fair wage that would enable him to have a modicum of security, to just build a livable life. That's what William Freeman really wanted for himself. And the Fairness and Opportunity Act, that is the whole point of the Fairness and Opportunity Act, that people who choose to work in prisons, because nobody is trying to end opportunities for job training and the good reasons a person might want to work, the good reasons a non-incarcerated person or an incarcerated person might want to work. Nobody's trying to end that. But the Fairness and Opportunity Act, what it stipulates is that, first of all, incarcerated workers will have fair wages, and that also they will have opportunities to do things with their money that people who are not incarcerated take for granted. Things like save their money and earn interest on their money. You or I, we can put our money in a bank and we can earn interest on it. Incarcerated people can't do that. Why not? Why shouldn't they have that right too? That's what the Fairness and Opportunity Act addresses. So you asked me to project for the future. I say these acts are going to pass. They're going to pass, especially if New Yorkers support them, if New Yorkers let the Assembly and the Senate know that we support these measures. The No Slavery Act No Slavery in New York Act and the Fairness and Opportunity Act, they will pass, and they will greatly improve the lives of incarcerated New Yorkers.
Now, Dr. Bernstein, I got to ask a question, because in order for it to pass, people have to be aware, right? A lot of what we talk about on this show is bringing awareness to the issues that matter the most. Do you find that when it comes to this particular issue, that people are very aware of what's going on? I mean, I know they're aware that, we talk about mass incarceration, we talk about those things, but in a drawdown sense, to really know what's going on, how aware are people?
Yeah, well, people are very aware of certain things and very unaware of other things. So people tend to be at least people in my circle and probably in your circle too, people tend to be very aware of mass incarceration, of mass racialized incarceration, of the role of racism in mass incarceration. People are very aware of that. But they have some misunderstandings about some aspects of this history that are really important. One thing that people tend to get wrong is they tend to think that prison for profit originated in the South and it originated after the Civil War. So we tend to think that it started with the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution very famously outlaws forced labor, quote, except as a punishment for crime, unquote. And in a lot of popular understanding, a lot of people think that what that means was that as the South was forced to liberate enslaved people, white Southerners came up with a new form of slavery, slavery by another name, which was a way to re-enslave African Americans after the Civil War. Now, it is absolutely true that profit-driven prison originated in the context of abolition, but it originated in the context of Northern abolition, not Southern abolition. It originated 50 years before the Civil War. And so if we start the story with the South, if we start the story with the Civil War,
we're not telling the right story, we're not telling the whole story.
We're not telling the whole story. It is the right story.
Right.
But we're starting the story in the middle. And the problem with starting the story in the middle is that when we do that, we're letting the North off the hook. And what I want to do in Freeman's challenge is put the North back on the hook.
Yeah. So for people who want to get a copy of the book, find out more about it, what do they do?
Well, they can go to any online bookstore, or they can go to their local bookstore and ask for it. If it's not in stock, it can be ordered. So Freeman's Challenge, The Murder That Shook America's Original Prison for Profit, available either right there or by order wherever books are sold.
What is your hope that, and I mean, it sounds like a very basic question, but it's a very real question. What is your hope and takeaway after people have this experience of reading your book?
Well, I hope they are inspired in certain ways by William Freeman. I hope that they are inspired that this was a teenager who resisted the mighty Auburn system. He resisted prison for profit at its root. And if he resisted, we can find ways to resist too. And he tried a lot of ways to resist before he resorted to violence. And I hope people take inspiration from the ways he resisted early on before he resorted to violence. If he was this courageous, we can be that courageous too.
You did a lot of research. I
did.
And talk to us a little bit about, before we go, the research process and some of your sources. How were you able to come about?
Yeah. Well, it took me 9 years to write this book.
Wow.
It was a long process. I did a lot of archival research. I also went to the Auburn prison. So the Auburn State Prison still exists. It is now called the Auburn Correctional Facility. It houses approximately 1,300 men who work, and it is the oldest maximum security prison that is continually operating in the United States. And it is the site where all New York State license plates are made. All of them are made in the Auburn prison. So if you see a car today and it has a New York State license plate, you know that it was made by a man in the Auburn prison who was literally walking in William Freeman's footsteps. So as part of the research for this book, I went to what is now the Auburn Correctional Facility. I went there and I met men who make license plates. And I met men who are incarcerated there. And that was a really important part of this research.
Yeah. Dr. Bernstein, it's been great having you talking about this. Got to bring you back again. It's a meaningful conversation. And you've really put a lot of great context here for us to be able to look at. So anytime that we look at a license plate, you're seeing Auburn Correctional Facility in front view.
Yes, that's absolutely right. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for being with us. Listen, we are taking a quick break, and guess what? We'll be right back right after this.